All right, gang, let's cover one more shot here. So we'll be talking about the history of our main parties. Now, ever since the election of 1860, when the Republicans won the election without being on the ballot in the South, the Democrats and Republicans have been the main parties. And the Democrats go back really with founding more around Andrew Jackson, going back to the 1820s or so is where you start to see an emergence, a little bit of the Democratic Party. Although neither of those, I would argue, is really the foundation of the modern Democrat and Republican parties. I mean, it's been generations. Every generation faces new issues. The parties develop new positions on these issues. And what we see today is not the same party we saw back then. I would even argue the Democrats and Republicans today are not the same parties as they were in 1960, for instance. So our first parties emerged quickly after George Washington with the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. And those were the first two parties for a long time. Now, the Federalists become a bunch of traitors after the War of 1812, and then they're gone. Then we had an era of good feelings where we had the Democratic Republicans who kind of emerged, and they called themselves the Democrats. Their opponents calls them Republicans. History calls them the Democratic Republicans, which eventually kind of formed out to the Democrats versus the Whigs. The Whigs were like the anti-Andrew Jackson group, and then from there, eventually the Republicans kind of absorbed a lot of that. So I do want to talk about a political machine. It's a term you've probably heard from American history as I'm recording this for a group of seniors, Tammany Hall. But I do have a thing about a story in New Mexico, and I need to draw out a map for it. But basically, you can ask me to draw out the map for you in a live meet one day. But the governor of New Mexico was a Democrat who was fighting a Republican political machine. And U.S. Route 66 went through Santa Fe, New Mexico, but it kind of went through the state where the start and end point were more or less the same point in the state. But then when you got to the middle of the state, Route 66 went up to Santa Fe and then back down to Albuquerque without cutting straight across to save the distance. And when the governor lost, he then invoked a bunch of eminent domain because, back up a step, the Democratic governor who was expected to win lost, and he really blamed the Republican political establishment in Santa Fe for screwing him out of the election. And he started thinking, what could he do? Now, he had a 5-month lame duck period where after he was elected till he actually left office and the new governor took office, he invokes eminent domain. He uses whatever funds and everything he can necessary, and he actually ends up building a bypass of Route 66 to connect Santa Rosa, New Mexico, straight to Albuquerque, and that cut off. There was a lot of Republican business in Santa Fe that depended on the route. There were hotels, restaurants, gas stations, all that were supporting the Republican political machine in Santa Fe, and they all lost that business when the route bypassed Santa Fe. Now, third parties may bring out issues that others will absorb. Now, we need to talk about this as well in a Google Meet, but the thing is that most elections in the United States, especially for president, come down to within, say, 4 or 5 percentage points. So if one party, a Libertarian Party, for instance, if they start getting 7 or 8% of the votes, that is enough to likely swing an election. So, for instance, you take the Green Party. Like 20 years ago, the Green Party arguably took the presidency away from Al Gore. The Democrats weren't talking a lot about the environment back then. But if that third party could, or if the Democrats could then gain some of that support and get that Green Party vote, it could help them get that little edge they need to beat the Republicans. Another thing we saw if this happened was the Bull Moose Party that you learned about in American history, in APUSH or American History 2. Teddy Roosevelt kind of stole the presidential election away from his own party by splitting his own party up with the Bull Moose ticket and keeping support away from William Howard Taft. And it kind of opened the door for Woodrow Wilson to win the presidency. You might also see Ross Perot, 1992. Ross Perot arguably took the presidential election away from George H.W. Bush. So the types of third parties that we need to talk about, one's the issues-based, which is like your Libertarian, your Constitution parties. I mean, the Libertarians have a view on everything. They're basically anti-government. They're probably the only third party you need to know anything about in North Carolina. They're the only one on the ballot. But the Libertarians' answer is generally if it involves government rules, regulations, or involvement, the answer is the government shouldn't do it. So the government should not be involved in marriage, much less, I mean, you can marry who you want, but it shouldn't even be a government institution. We should have lower taxes, less military, less foreign involvement. Just get the government out of stuff and leave people alone. on one fringe of the Libertarian Party, you'll even find people who don't think there should even be a driver's license to drive. The Green Party, for instance, might be one that just had one issue. It was basically to preserve the environment. And sometimes you see one kind of rally around one person. That's exceptionally rare. I mean, Ross Perot and Teddy Roosevelt are the only ones I really know of on the national level that were ever major. I'll post these videos elsewhere for you. Which actually, I got ahead of myself and started talking about this. But these are the ones that you would want to know about today. This being your issues-based one issue party. This being your multi-issue party. And I thought you'd enjoy a little fun picture there. My favorite party, however, you can look these guys up. I won't read it all for you, but you can certainly pause the slide and take a look. They were a mock party in Canada, and they said a rhinoceros represents the common politician because it's a really slow, stupid, dim-witted animal that moves really fast whenever it's in danger. And they just made up like little mock jokes as their party platform, and they existed for many, many years. So, how do you join a party? As far as joining the official count, you would have to actually register to vote and register in that party. And that's how you're counted in the official group. As far as if you want to go volunteer, work, donate, or whatever for a party, you can do that, of course, on your own. You don't even necessarily have to be a citizen. So remember, though, our requirements to vote: you have to be of age, you have to be a citizen, and you have to be registered. You have to then register in the area you're going to live. And if you follow that, really the only people who can be a Democrat, Republican, or Libertarian officially, or whoever, is a registered voter, 18 years of age, who's a U.S. citizen. I mentioned in yesterday's video, I'll talk a little bit about philosophy. And conservatives, and this is a chart here that you can take a look at and see what these differences are. Conservatives tend to be Republicans. Tradition, for instance. Republicans tend to say that the tradition is marriage is between a man and a woman. And traditional values, they're pro-life. Duty to country. Republicans, although this whole country has a thing where we really, really honor our military, but it's also Republicans who take great pride in showing the most honor to the military. They see duty. They're more likely to be pro-draft. They see it as a duty to the country to serve, whereas liberals might see it as something more towards something you would do more voluntarily, not out of duty. Conservatives are also the party of order and law and order, they call themselves. Trump makes a point of this, that he's a law and order president, and keeps saying Trump or Biden is not the guy for law and order. The old ways of hierarchy, if you go back to like absolutism in Europe, authority, honor, they're also more pro-charity versus pro-government help if you're conservative. And if you think about these ideals, they're also things that fit with the Republican. You could have, and in North Carolina, we used to see this. I don't see it so much anymore, but somebody would call themselves a conservative Democrats. And what they meant was they're a Democrat, but maybe they're more pro-life, for instance. Maybe they are, what would be another good example? Like, for example, we were the last state on the East Coast that adopted the lottery, for example. And that was kind of a conservative element of us not wanting to join that gambling and all. So hopefully you enjoyed the video. Hopefully this was educational for you. Enjoy your time.